So there's different question strategies, but before you know the question strategies, you need to kind of know what different types of questions there are. But effective questioning strategies will guide and promote critical interaction. So you're guiding and you're promoting, and then all along you're looking for critical interaction, not covering, critical interaction. Also, once you give them students a question, they need to have time to process it. They need to think about it to develop their higher level thinking and feeling responses. They come hand in hand. They're not just going to think, they're also going to have some feelings about what they're thinking about, because if the question is highly controversial, they're going to have strong feelings. So you can see how thinking and feeling come together, the cognitive and the affective domains. Then there are 4 types of questions. Actually, there's 5. One of the types you combine, but we're going to go over 4, and then I'll explain the 5th. So there's 4 types of questions that encourage learners to use higher levels of cognitive thinking, affective, their feeling, and their processes for critical thinking. So the 4 we're going to look at are convergent, divergent, and evaluative questions, and then I didn't put the 4th one on here, Socratic questions. Socratic is the 4th. So let's look at convergent questions. Convergent questions are limited. They're looking for a response to a given question, and the question is narrowly defined. There is a correct answer. So what happens is the answer is short. It doesn't take a lot of reflection because there's one answer, and it's in memory recall of factual information. So there's not much. It's not very deep. But you can use these types of questions to check your students' understanding, to see if they understand maybe the terminology, identifying parts of information, and also interpreting the information in a new way. So the convergent questions are asking students to analyze by breaking down parts, recognizing patterns, and forming assumptions. But what happens is these type of questions don't generate a lot of interaction. Typically they're done after, when you want to come to a solution. All right, we've gone out and explored and done all these things. Now we want to come to a solution. We want to come down to an answer that we came up with. But if you have forum discussions, you don't really want to use convergent questions because you're not going to get a lot of interaction. You're going to get a lot of one-sentence responses, and a lot of them will be the same responses. So convergent questions aren't really good for an open forum discussion. Now divergent questions are open-ended. So you're going to have to come up with some information or recall some information and apply what you recall to explain or extrapolate or further analyze topic, situation, or problem. So it's open-ended, and there isn't one right answer. So divergent questions are broad. They can have multiple answers, and what's most important is it requires a higher level of thinking. When we say higher level, we're higher level of thinking up on Bloom's, so it's more analyzing, synthesizing, evaluating, predicting, those sorts of things. Divergent questions are for exploring. Divergent questions often challenge the learners. So how do they challenge them? They take the information, bring it together, and synthesize it to come up with something creative and original. So it's open, and you take you take the different possibilities, you explore, you analyze, you evaluate, you bring it all together, you synthesize it in a new, creative, original thinking, well, I guess you could say learning artifact or answers to questions or projects or whatever. So the main point here is that questions are not just used for forums, they can be used in projects, they're used everywhere in learning. So think to yourself, how much questioning do I do with my students? Okay, evaluative questions. Evaluative questions are comparative analysis, looking for different perspectives. And based on those perspectives, learners synthesize the information so that they can come up with some solution or conclusion. So they're evaluating, they're comparing different sides of issues, and then they bring it all together and reach a conclusion. These also require higher levels of both cognitive and emotional. So the cognitive and the affective domains. They promote critical thinking and reflection opportunities. So evaluation questions are great because you're doing both reflection and critical thinking. So how do learners evaluate? So they assess the situation, and then based on their assessment, they give appraisals, and then based on that, they have to defend what they decided on. And usually they're given a certain set of criteria. Based on that criteria, they make their own justifications because they have some sort of beliefs. You have their beliefs, the criteria, and then their justification brings the two together. After that, they reflect and support their opinion. So it's not a one-stage process. These evaluative questions can be really great in forum discussions because they're emotional and they can become intense. So you might want to, let's see, you could evaluate the government shutdown now. You know that some are going to be more intense and emotional than others. What happens, though, is you as a facilitator, you have to be a really good facilitator in this situation because since it is emotional, people can get out of control. And you don't want a lot of arguing going on, and you want to be able to facilitate the process. Then we have Socratic questioning. This is the best for promoting critical thinking, this type of strategy using Socratic questioning. However, it's also the hardest. We use it to clarify for clarity and logical consistency. And that's really clarity, especially logical consistency. A lot of we just talked about emotions, and logical consistency is in direct opposition to our emotion. If we get emotional, we a lot of times lose the logic. So we want to promote critical thinking through clarity and logical consistency. How do we do this? Learners look deeply. I mean deeply. They don't just cover, they look into assumptions, point of views, perspectives, evidence, reasons, concepts, consequences. So they try to look at the whole picture. These types of questions, when students are answering them, they're identifying cause and effect. This is what caused it, this is what happened, cause and effect. But I think one of the most common responses you'll see in Socratic questioning is, so what? Somebody says something, and they make a statement, they make a stand. This is their point of view, and you go, so what? I mean, so what? Why does that matter? And then students come up with relevant responses. And it matters deeply to some people. But expressing that in a clear and logical way is difficult. So learners are asked to clarify. Clarify how you're feeling, what you're saying. Why is it meaningful to you? Give me some justification and some evidence that will support why it's really meaningful for you, and be clear and be logical. How often do we teach that? How often do we follow up with our questions when students are very vague in general? Do we let it go at that? Or we ask them to clarify and to come back and answer so what questions? When you ask them so what questions, it makes the learner, let's take a look at some different possibilities, some different paths. Let's take the path less traveled. You're asking them to look beyond covering the content. So these types of questions, Socratic questions, help learners understand why it's important, what's behind what they're discussing online, and it gives more meaning to the discussion. And then there's another one that I'll just mention briefly. You can combine divergent and convergent questions. So I think last week I talked about this a little bit. Divergent, you go out and you analyze in a team maybe, and you go out and explore, synthesize, and you come up with that's your divergent questions, and then after that you come together possibly and converge on your solutions. So you can combine these couple of strategies together. Okay. Then the final slide I have here is take a look at this and think about how you ask questions in the courses you teach. Do you challenge students? Do your questions arouse their curiosity? Do you establish a foundation when you're providing them new types of work to do? Here's the foundation. This is the basics that you have to have. Do you encourage students to reply to each other? Do you clear up misconceptions when you see them in the conversations? Do you look at what students are saying and verify that they got it or they don't get it? Do they comprehend? Do they understand? Do you let your students self-evaluate? Look at how they're doing, reflect on their own. Do you ask students to interpret, analyze, think critically, see relationships, make judgments? Do you ask questions that will build class rapport? Do you try to find out what the student's special interests are? All of these are asked through questions. Do your questions help students feel each one has something positive to contribute, which is huge? Then, to what extent do you think about your questions before you ask them? If you're in an online class, you probably do a lot of pre-planning. But when you do that pre-planning for your questions, do you go through this process? Do you really think about it? Or do you just open up a textbook and take a question from a textbook and maybe modify it slightly? Or are you really thinking about critical thinking? Are you critically thinking? So when you pre-plan the questions, do you consider possible responses that students are going to have? So I guess what we're saying in a large degree is, do you allow students to think for themselves? And do you do a variety of questions? We went through some different types. So do you mix it up? And then how often are your students interacting with each other? And in online classes is huge because we have to create the interaction. Then how do you respond to students' responses? In a neutral manner, or are you like, great, no, that's wrong? Or do you respond neutrally? And then finally, do you have your students ask questions? And do you encourage them to ask questions? Because if you remember before, they're thinking critically when they're asking questions, and you can see what kind of thinking they're doing by the questions they ask. So that's a general overview of this week's topic.